Been to the company for a long time. Also, Allison Tompkins, who wrote under Allison Tellery, is right back there in the corner. So give her a welcome too. Shy as she might be. Also, appearing out of the blue in my email about a week ago, Denny Drew is a longtime member of fandom. Haven't seen him for about, what, 15 years or so? And this is his first time down here. Give him a hand, too. And this troublesome person here with my camera is Ron Davis. His first club meeting. I've kind of been wanting to do some sort of a panel like this at the club for some time. Part of our mission is education. And I don't think we've talked enough about the contributions that Kansas City writers have made to the science fiction genre. We have a long history going back into the 40s. I brought some people up here that I thought would be particularly loquacious about the subject. Please welcome Ken Keller and Jim Murray. Loquacious is the word. That'll do nicely. We're going to talk about the various writers beginning with Manly Wade Wellman back in the 40s and the very early 50s, and moving right up to present-day writers. I'm sorry, Manly Bannister, not Manly Wade Wellman, thank you. Moving right down to present day, some of the real newcomers like Dayton Ward, who are working actively right here out of Kansas City. Maybe you've heard of these people, maybe you haven't. We want to introduce you to them. We'll carry on a dialogue among ourselves, and also you two, if you have questions or comments as we go, feel free. Ken, yeah. You and I have been talking over the computer for the last couple of nights about Manly Bannister, Manly Miles Bannister. As far as we know, the first writer working professionally here out of Kansas City, and seemingly a lonely figure, too.
A lonely figure, indeed.
Why don't you take over?
Okay. There's lots of fragmentary information about Bannister on the internet. In fact, I have found, and with Robin's assistance, have found enough information that I think I can now do a good, strong, basic entry for him in Wikipedia. But Manly Bannister came on the scene in 1942. Apparently, that's when he sold his first professional story. And he was not a prolific writer, but he was a continuous writer for the next 22 years. He also had a dual career. Apparently, I think it's after science fiction. He published a series of how-to books that covered the area of everything from intaglio printing, printmaking, stone lithograph pulling, book binding. There was even a book that he did on making picture frames. And this, back in an era where that type of material was not really considered hobbyist type of material. There were people who practiced it. And he helped popularize those in an era when the highest form of technology was your telephone and maybe your TV set and radio.
He did all of the typesetting and all of the wood cutting work, all of that by hand.
He cut stencils. As I said, his first story was in 1942. His final piece of fiction, which was a two-part serial, appeared in 1964. Robin found an address for him, which I drove past today, in 1905 South Spruce, which is very near where the post office is over in northeast Kansas City, where the old Sears building used to be. It's now not a very good neighborhood. Back in 1950, when he was at the height of his activity in both fandom and proto, it would have been a real middle-class neighborhood. Now, what I'd like to suggest, Robin, is that we do a fuller presentation on Bannister as a program item at a later Taxis meeting. And just use this as an introduction because we've got so much. This is the only published novel in book form called The Conquest of Earth. This was actually a serial that ran in Amazing Stories for 4 issues, and this is a truncated version of that serial. It's about 25% smaller than the original serial. And it was called The Scarlet Sage was the original title of this. He also had another novel that apparently was only serialized called Magnethorpus. And I don't know the source for that, but it was a two-part serial that appeared in 1961, near the end of his writing career. He was born in 1934 and he died in 1986. He was born in Washington State, and we don't know if he was still living in Kansas City when he died or not, or how many residences he had. There's still just fragmentary information about him. But he was the lone professional and science fiction fan who was active in science fiction fandom. He published a semi-prozine, which back in those days would have been called a fanzine, called the Necromanticon. And it was a fiction market. And tell them who some of the writers were that appeared in Necromanticon.
Well, John Turner appeared under the pseudonym of M. Houston. David Bunch, I don't know if
David R. Bunch.
All that well known these days, but he was a very prolific short story writer in the 60s and 70s and continued writing up until the 80s. I've forgotten the name of David R. Cedric Walker,
right.
who
E.C.
published one of the, or co-published one of the major British fanzines with Walt Willis called Slant, published fiction there. And there was, as you might gather from the name of the fanzine, Necromanticon, there was apparently, sort of originally at least, to be a tie-in with the H.P. Lovecraft mythos. And one of the seminal stories in that mythos was actually published by basically a fan in that magazine, and it was called Why Abdul al-Hazred Went Mad. If you are familiar with Lovecraft, he's the mad sheik who wrote the book, the Necronomicon, that is at the backbone of so much of the mythos. And that first story originally appeared in Bannister's fanzine.
Also, our own Bob Tucker sold the story, the final issue, number 5, that appeared in 1951. Something I found out just last night is that when they were awarding the Retro Hugo Awards, Necromanticon was one of the nominees for that year, did not win. The Retro Hugos filled in the years prior to the awarding of the first Hugo in 1953. But the thing that surprised me the most was that Bannister was not only an active professional, but he was very involved in science fiction fandom. And in those days, in those almost pre-television days, fandom was fanzine publishing. You either exchanged letters, made the occasional very expensive long-distance phone call, or fandom survived on the printed page. And he decided, for whatever reasons, to attempt one of the very early semi-prozines, which presaged his publications like Paul Ganley's Weird Book or Stuart Schiff's Whispers, which came out in the 70s and the 80s. In fact, he may be the first professional writer who published a fiction market that would be considered a small press fiction magazine by standards. Now, these kind of publications have been around a long time in American letters, but I believe this is the first indication that I've ever found that it started to happen in 1950 for science fiction. And remember, by 1950, all the major pulp magazines had been dying off. The few that survived became digest-sized. Amazing, FNSF, Galaxy, and Astounding were all those, I believe, that survived. And there were a few very minor ones here and there with spotty issues through the 50s. But the pulp era was largely dead by 1950 or dying. So Bannister came out of this tradition. And other than this, that's about all we've been able to find. What I find most tragic is that if he was living here when Captures was formed in 1971, we never knew about him and never had any contact with him. And I wonder if in the last 20 years of his life we could have helped revive his interest in fandom, assuming that he had lost it. He doesn't seem to have published anything after '64, and he only published 5 issues of Necromanticon. But he was in contact and very active in science